Today you're going to receive a talk by Dr. Lisa Luengo from the French department in the Foreign Languages department. She teaches both French and Spanish. She studied international studies and Francophone studies all the way through her career, all the way up into her doctorate in Francophone studies. She's multicultural. She has experience in the Spanish-speaking world, the French-speaking world, and the English-speaking world as a native speaker. And so I think, without further ado, let's welcome our very own Dr. Lisa Luengo to Green River.
Hello. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. My name is Lisa Luengo. For those of you who don't know me, my students, hopefully you know me, you know who I am. Otherwise, we need to talk after this. I am French faculty here at Green River, and today I'm going to be talking about intersectionalities in the Francophone world. So, big title, complex topic. We're going to break it down. There are going to be several parts, which I'll be addressing. I'll be asking you some questions too, just to kind of gauge where you're at and what you think about certain topics. So hopefully this will be something that's exciting, interesting, and challenging for you. That's my hope. So, I like to say that in the study of the Francophone world, we go from the language of the oppressor to the language of the liberator. And what does that mean? The term Francophone has undergone a vast transformation from when it referred to belonging to a French-speaking country, being an individual who spoke French, whether that person was in a colonized, post-colonized, or hexagon. We'll see what that means, country. But today, now, we're following the wave of postmodern understandings of identity. Identity as multiple, fragmented, context-sensitive. We reject the notion of a Francophone identity that is determined and fixed in time. We therefore challenge French-centric conceptions of Francophonie, and here I'm using the French term, as a shaping force of the production and study of the entire French language, literature, culture, film, and art, both inside and outside of mainland France. So, the traditional view of Francophone cultural productions as pertaining to the hexagon. So the French call France a hexagon, and you kind of have to use your imagination, and I'm unable to draw anything, so apologies. But the hexagon is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are like kind of 6 sides to France. This looks like a losange, so that doesn't look at all like a hexagon. But again, use your imagination. We call it a hexagon with 6 sides, even though it doesn't really look like it. This doesn't look like it. Apologies. In any case, the traditional view of Francophone cultural productions is replaced today by a pluricentric conception that reads interrelated aspects of Francophonie as products of specific contexts and conditions rising from post-colonial encounters with France. So, just as language will play a prominent role in our talk today, language always plays a prominent role in my life, every moment of the day, just about. We will look at geographical areas long defined as the peripheries of the French-speaking world, and I'm thinking of the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, the Maghreb, Sub-Saharan Africa, Quebec. Quebec, don't let me stop this talk today without talking about the elections from yesterday, because something really important happened in Quebec that actually ties completely with this talk. So, since I didn't really make notes of it, since it just happened, I can't leave without talking about it. Excuse me, going on. We'll also look at French cities that have a preponderance of immigrant populations. These disputed sites of French identity present a prolific formulation of local Francophone identities that do not fit with concepts of linguistic and ethnic exclusiveness that they are consistent with a pluralistic demographic shift in the true face of Frenchness that is indeed plural. So this talk today will consist of 3 parts. To illustrate the complexities of intersectionalities in the Francophone world, in the first part, I will address Charlie Hebdo, and we'll talk about Charlie Hebdo, what it is, what it was, what happened. In the second, I will look at immigration in the Quebec province. And third, the study will look how language is transformed in a novel, drawing from both French and Spanish. And maybe to tie it up, I'll have a little bit of personal history, just at the end. Tie it up. So, we're backing up a bit. Among these geographical areas referred to before are French sites that have long been characterized by big immigrant populations. I'm thinking of Marseille and Montpellier in the south of France. I'm thinking about Parisian suburbs such as Seine-Saint-Denis, Bobigny, Aulnay-sous-Bois. Given their varying political realities, these regions represent contested sites of French collective identity, producing a set of distinctive literary, linguistic, musical, art expression. And this goes against this integrationist vision of Frenchness that has come to dominate the metropolitan public sphere, also defined as French identity, despite the demonstrable presence and influence of a variety of immigrant groups on French soil. But it is here that the French, in this particularly French way, and I resent saying it, but at the same time it is true, emerges from a universalist model advocated by the French Revolution, the paradoxes of both belonging and otherness. Assimilation has been promised to immigrants, but at a cost, usually one involving the changing, abandoning their cultures of origin, of their food. Cultura, ajo, all of those offensive, strong scents. Mon Dieu, those poor aristocratic French noses couldn't be able to handle, right? So we have this clash here. Now, France's 300-year-long colonial undertaking was implicitly predicated on the recognition, codification, and colonial undertaking of racial difference and all the corollaries, superiority, inferiority, dominance, and submission, then these long-standing patterns of thought and action cannot be swept away as easily as, for example, just enacting a law. Interestingly, these paradoxes are duplicated in colonized geographical sites such as Quebec, which again we'll be studying a little bit later today. So, in refusing to acknowledge or to account for the fragmentation of Frenchness, its pluralization into the simultaneity of identities, then French subjects are tacitly refusing to come to terms both with the remnants of racism in contemporary France and with its dark origins in the French colonial experience, which our contemporary post-colonial France seems unable to shake off. So, to illustrate the first part, we're going to look at Charlie Hebdo. Charlie Hebdo. Is that okay that I wrote on this?
Oui.
Does anybody recognize Charlie Hebdo? What it means? Care to share? So, to sum it up, 2015, January 9th, 2 gunmen entered the offices of Charlie Hebdo. Was, is, will always be a satirist, satirist magazine that aims to shock, offend, disturb. It's deeply secularist. It is deeply anti-religious, anti-religion. 2 gunmen entered on that January 9th and killed 12 people, including the editor and the cartoonists. As a result, millions of people turned out in the streets of Paris in a show of solidarity with those who were killed. They did so under the banner of freedom of the press, freedom of expression, and to stand up against terrorism. And if I had been in France, I would have been marching there as well. But if we consider that during that same time and before, many more people, hundreds, possibly thousands, were killed in Nigeria by the group Boko Haram, and barely a word of support was uttered by those millions that turned out in the streets of Paris, then we need to begin to question the underlying motivation for the expressions of solidarity with Charlie Hebdo, but not also with Nigerian civilians. In order to capture a more complex, pluralistic solidarity with the killings, with the brutal murders of Charlie Hebdo, we would have needed to include as well an indictment of French colonial legacy, still braided in state practices and cultural, social, economic attitudes of French, of European descent, towards racialized French citizens and residents. Applying an intersectional analysis to the events in Paris requires understanding the racialized otherings of Muslims and Arabs in France, the long and violent colonial history between France and Algeria, and by extension, the treatment of Algerians in France, or French of Algerian descent. For example, I'm sorry, my French comes out. Charlie Hebdo represented a broader disrespect of French society of Muslims and Muslim cultural practices, which is also reflected, for example, in the banning of the hijab for Arab and Muslim women. There would have also need to be an account of the interplay between race, religion, Islam, and nationalism. The French show of solidarity must be made in rejection of French nationalism. Showing up to protest the most overt acts of violence, and the acts of violence we're closest to, the ones that potentially threaten our safety and security, and not challenge institutionalized systems of oppression, makes us compliant to them. Intersectionality then demands that we offer incisive, multidimensional criticism and engage in complex politics and shows of solidarity that do not fit in neatly compartmentalized boxes. It means that we're always asking questions about the role of race, gender, economics, religion, and the state. It means we're always looking beyond our borders and boundaries, asking questions about what our governments are doing overseas and how those activities might impact us back at home. I was born and raised in the outskirts of Paris. I was bathed in the elusive luminosity of the City of Lights, and I left when I was 18. I was there for all of my formative years. And when you hear the word Paris, and this we have to tell you, what do you think of? Eiffel Tower. Delicious food. The indomitable baguette. What else? I heard romance. Ooh. Yeah, architecture. History. Great. Yeah. I will always consider myself a Parisian. No matter the years away from it, I'm a willing product of this belonging mold that was imposed by the hexagon. Yet I hopefully am a working and lucid and critical one as well. I'm unable to give you the names of the streets in Paris, but if you drop me off anywhere, I can find myself around. The smells of the metro make me swoon. So that's fun. Someone's coming in. Flea markets, scores of people, loud. I love it. It's like a cocoon, right? Yet, there's no stamp of authenticity to me because I'm the daughter of a feisty Irish, Italian, American mother from Chicago and the daughter of a Spanish Civil War refugee father. So early on, I realized that I wasn't the right kind of French for many around me. From remarks regarding how Spanish immigrants were only good enough to clean French people's homes and yards, to manners in which my mother was treated because of her American accent, I learned early on that there was the right kind of French and there was the wrong kind of French. My mom had a thick accent when she spoke French, which she still does today, and frankly, I'm convinced she's always done it on purpose. I think somewhere inside my mother, there's this aristocratic French lady just getting a kick out of infuriating the French around her. The French are pure souche, of pure root or stem, as the French like to call themselves. But in that process of infuriating a lot of people, she was met with derision and mockery. She still did it. Matches and gasoline is my nickname for my mother. So, for example, there were times when French women in stores pretended they couldn't understand what my mother was saying, even though she was speaking French. But she was speaking French with an accent, more so a noticeable American accent at a time when anti-Americanism was at a high. Well, you know, still, but it ebbs and flows at that time, right? We're thinking about the Vietnam War, right? These incidents enraged me. I stepped in to demand deferent apologies from my mother in my most Parisian, rude, working-class accent, which, although far from the upper-class inflections sought after by the bourgeoisie, new and old, nonetheless conferred a stamp of authenticity to me linguistically. I got my linguistic stamp of authenticity. This only cemented my resolve to know, to teach, to love the French language better than the true French themselves. What it also brought me was a realization of the value placed on language, that language could be a tool for oppression, that if it happened in Paris, birthplace of the Enlightenment, the siècle des Lumières, how bad was it in a post-colonization geographical site? This question challenged the transparent use of the language for communication, underscored the ease with which it became a tool at the service of oppression, albeit through subterranean channels. For more than 300 years, French language enabled the codification, recognition, and exploitation in regions ranging from the Caribbean, North America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Maghreb, Middle East, Southeast Asia. We've already mentioned those areas. For centuries, it was the language of the administration, of the elite, of French education imposed as the wiping away of the local language was institutionalized. The French language carries inside this dark past, but in the transformative journey we witness today, we reject modifying the lexicon of French, but rather understand in its vocabulary the echoes of its colonial past. It's not a matter of rejecting the language, that's an impossible thing to do, but on the contrary, grasping it so that we can express realities and durations that are not anchored in mainland France. Let's remember, in the 50s, French had become a double-edged sword which vacillated between language of oppressor and language of liberation. Up until then, the trauma was expressed as exile, as an interior exile where native languages were held hostage, inaccessible. Inside the school in Africa, in Northern Africa, the classical program remained for a long time a problem because the schools were built to form administrators. So once that language had been changed, once the regional, local dialects had been wiped away, the language changed the culture, the history in the past, and the question became, how could that language serve Algerian, Tunisian, Moroccan writers who found themselves witness to the injustice and the violence of a colonized country? The same was true for the Middle East, where education was part of a broader mission civilisatrice, the civilized mission, emblem for France's colonial power. Here as well, schools were a space for colonial and diplomatic power struggles between 1936 and 1945, stemming all the way back up to the 50s. Often underestimated in their importance to colonial affairs, schools were an integral part of France's vulnerable administration in the Middle East. Within these contexts of these policies, French schools became a symbol of privilege for Francophone Christian elites and of oppression for Muslim or pan-Arab groups. Nevertheless, in Northern Africa, writers from Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco presently took this language as a weapon, turned it against the colonizer, yet never forgetting that the language itself was strictly linked to the conquest of their land, and so that language represented a lack, an absence of one's culture and past a trauma. Now, we talk about a double-edged sword in terms of this language of the oppressor that came in and imposed itself, but it's important to remember and understand that at the same time, the French language was a carrier of French thought and paradoxically of French freedom in the sense that it was meant to reflect on the philosophers of the Enlightenment, those who paved the way not just for modern thought, but also for human rights, and this happening through the formulation of the French language, but at the expense of others. I'm thinking about the afrancesados, for example, that same paradox of Portuguese and Spanish partisans who adhere to the principles of the Enlightenment and welcome the French presence, the French armies in Spain, in America. Sorry, I don't want to segue. I already have enough that I want to say here. So the challenge becomes to use language. Precisely, it's done with the intention to appropriate, to absorb it, render it malleable so that native culture can braid itself to its old world colonizing schema. Now, in my research, I wondered if linguistic oppression persisted, and I assumed it did, in its post-colonial iteration. How was it manifesting itself? Where was it manifesting itself? And how could we study it? In doing so, three major aspects were taken into account: language, identity, and culture in the study. We live in multicultural societies, and for the interest of this presentation, in my interest, we're looking at individuals living in societies that are interacting between native cultures and the oppressive channel of the French language. So in order to take into account this discrimination, I chose to look at the Quebec scenario. Quebec, we know, is a Francophone region in Canada of great importance. Don't let me forget about the elections, that just happened. In the sense, it's positioned itself in opposition to the Anglophone, the rest of the country, even though French is the official language of the whole country. It's a highly politicized region. Again, talking about yesterday, but back in 1967, President and General President of France, and the man who considered himself for having saved France millions of times, World War II, May 68, you name it, who took over and made sure that all French people were going to be okay forever. I'm talking about Charles de Gaulle, of course, went to Quebec and proclaimed, does anybody know what he said? Does anybody know what Charles de Gaulle said? In Quebec, to create all sorts of troubles. Vive le Québec libre. Long live free Quebec. He was known for speaking first and thinking after. He also is the origin of all sorts of very funny quotes. mainly about the French, and the main one being how can anyone govern a nation that has 246 different kinds of cheese? Haven't heard that one? That's a great one. The other great one is I get angry when I'm right. Churchill gets angry when he's wrong. We get angry at each other all the time. I mean, you know, for that reason. But infuriating. And so what happened is that he just aligned himself with the Quebec independent movement, provoked a diplomatic incident, incredible interference of the French in the domestic affairs of Canada, but he also really propelled the notion of independence through 4 words he spoke. So 10 years later, if we go 10 years later quickly, we see a chart of the French language that comes to be adopted, known as the Loi 101, which is the Law 101. It's a chart that imposes the exclusive usage of French in all public postings, commercial publicities, businesses employing more than 50 people. It forbids Francophone families from going to an Anglophone school. So, for example, if you've got parents who are Francophone and want to send their kids to an Anglophone school, they can't. It also recognized the French version of laws as being the only official language. So it really anchored that idea of difference, which in turn paved the way for linguistic exclusion. And we see this inequality, we see this exclusion with immigrants who come to Montreal, to Quebec, and I have a couple of really great quotes by women who talk about what it is to be in Quebec in a Francophone area. I feel like here, they want me to speak French, and if you don't speak French, then shame on you kind of thing. Even if the person can't speak English, a lot of the times, they will pretend they can't speak English because they feel you are in my province. Wouldn't you speak my language? Well, they don't take into consideration I just got here. Give me time to learn. I don't feel we take the time to find out, you know, to go beyond the iceberg, to see what people really are like. We just assume you're here in Quebec, you should be speaking French. I got here a month ago. I'm willing to learn French. I think I learned a lot, considering I just got here, but I need money to go to the French school. Give me the money, I will go. And even if I don't need to pay for the school, I need to take the bus to get there. Underscored here is the inequality placed on immigrants. Women who arrive in Quebec are expected to speak French already. It's so interesting because from my experience growing up in France, a lot of grief had been placed on the Québécois, on the accent, on the manner of speaking, on the stereotypical lack of sophistication they somehow conveyed from being in French Canada. And yet, we find here duplicated and repeated the same pattern, but onto people who are unable to communicate. How many of you have traveled to places where you didn't speak the language and felt like there was stress because of that language barrier? Do you care to share like that experience?
In 2014, I traveled to China with my church youth group, and we were helping an orphanage. Kids were speaking, and I was just kind of sitting there kind of awkwardly, and 3 of the kids that we went, that from my church, spoke Cantonese of what they spoke, and I couldn't do anything, and I just felt very awkward. Couldn't interact or couldn't do anything.
Right, there's an immediate sense of exclusion. It's not as if you can use, I mean, language is so much of who we are and how we are, that exclusion makes us feel very self-conscious immediately. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Something slightly different is, being an English speaker in these foreign countries, I realized that just even having a little bit of knowledge about the language and trying to speak that language first instead of English first, to them, they're all of a sudden see me soften and ingratiate myself to them that I was trying that.
Yeah.
So even though I have felt in different places that exclusion, I also felt the warmth by people when they recognize that you're trying.
And that's a really essential aspect because it does make a big difference. We also need to be able to be in a position where we can think about it ahead of time. Where we can already start thinking, okay, well, I'm going to be going there, and I should probably be thinking about how to communicate once I'm there. But to others, it's something that's not accessible. And it's that inaccessibility that makes the exclusion all the more traumatic. So it's again, looking at intersectionality, that's where language comes. But that possibility of, we're going to talk about that, so I'm so glad you bring it up, of entering another language at whatever level is absolutely essential. So, anybody else? All right, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because otherwise I do want to leave some time for questions at the end. Elections were held in Quebec province yesterday. And what the results of that election is that they're parliamentary elections. The Quebec Liberals got ousted, and the majority, the party that won in the majority is called CAQ, which is Coalition Avenir Québec, Coalition Future Québec. It won clear majority. Its first reform is immigration. It wants to curtail immigration from 50 to 40,000 people, and it wants to give a French language test to immigrants who, if they fail, are deported. So, in doing all of this research, I've been thinking about language, exclusion, oppression, domination, submission, all of these different genres, but always through language because that's what I live. And looking at the results of the election yesterday, I thought, this is just a confirmation, it's a cementing of that exclusion that is going to take place. For people who are immigrants who are already in Quebec, there's a 3-year probation for learning French. If you're not able after 3 years, you've already been in Quebec, of proving of your language, you're ousted. Which really is extraordinary when you think of it. So what does one do? What do we do? What do we do, right? I mean, how does one, linguistically speaking, sorry, maybe first. How does one undermine a language serving as a tool for discrimination and inequality? How does one address the foreignness of language and the foreignness in language? When I was writing my dissertation on memory, trauma, testimony through an exilic language, fun stuff, it's great. Every day it's like, woohoo, trauma. Well, what am I going to read today? Holocaust. Okay, bring it on. Zola. Oh, he was such a fun guy. So I did really enjoy it, but it wasn't fun stuff. I wrote about this Spanish writer called Jorge Sambruna. And if ever you come across one of his books, anything, read it. He was in exile of the Spanish Civil War, like my father, settled in France, like my father, became a phenomenal writer, not like my father. He talked, thought, lived a lot about this idea of the instability of language. So back in the 70s already, he was asking himself questions regarding the role of language as a marker for identity. He published this novel in 1981 called L'Algarabie. And Algarabie is taken from the Spanish word Algarabia, and it in fact doesn't exist in French. Algarabie does not exist. In order to translate Algarabia, you'd have to say brouhaha, commotion, it denotes the noise, the commotion that many people talking at the same time, right? That's what it means. This is our first group. In regarding Saint-Prin's quest to decolonize the French language, his tackling of the complexities of language and the fight against linguistic supremacy. Saint-Prin is one of the hundreds of thousands of refugees who leave their home, their language, must build in a foreign land. His status was a political refugee, but the process is the same for anyone seeking elsewhere a life with better security who goes through it in a foreign language. So the struggle between the self, the language left behind, the language necessary to adopt, and the process of memory can't be better explained than in this book, which is a really difficult book to read because it navigates between French and Spanish. It goes back and forth. But that's exactly this in-between state that this writer wants us to feel, because he wants us to understand that when you're faced with a geographical and linguistic exile, the language the immigrant or the refugee enters has to become a sort of land for the writer and a tool for the testimony to emerge. For this amazing writer, the process redefines autobiography. The language the autobiographer creates in exile changes his identity, demands a reconstruction of the self through the experience of linguistic exile. It illustrates the creation of a language neither Spanish nor French, in which French serves as the instrument and Spanish is the substance to be sculpted. This reconstructive fragmentation, that's what he's doing, is both geographic and ideological, cultural in nature. The pertinent analysis here tend to fit into two basic ideological patterns. One that emphasizes the primacy of the message conveyed by the Francophones, and another that stresses the importance of the forms deployed. What it does is this book challenges the French-centered conceptions of Francophonie as the shaping force of the production, the study of the French language, and of French literature on its own. There's a couple of quotes I want to give you. Expliquer. Peut-on expliquer? Is it possible to explain? Is this something that we can do? This is the task that Saint-Prin sets in writing throughout this novel, as he endeavors to explain the losses in his life, the losses of exile, the collective death he experienced being in a concentration camp. But in this loss, he creates a method for communication that skips both the cultural rigidity of French and that of Spanish. He practices the insertion of Spanish and French, the reclaiming of French words, phonetics, etymology, genre patchwork, even like telenovela. I mean, he just explores. It's this just explosion of different genres that happen in his book. But he does so to craft a language that escapes the confines of the categories previously described, and also the pitfalls, to escape the pitfalls for discrimination. He feels he's a prisoner of Spanish culture, since culture and language reflect each other. Il n'y a rien au monde que je déteste davantage que l'Espagne de Franco. Et je ne te parle pas seulement de son système politique, je te parle de son langage, cette infecte rhétorique castillane, cette langue de l'Empire. There's nothing in the world, this is the translation, there's nothing in the world I hate more than Franco's Spain. I'm not just talking here about the political system, I'm talking about its language, this detestable Castilian rhetoric, this language of the empire. So, Spanish language must be transformed in order to provide somehow an acceptable channel for communication. But how do you reconcile? How do you reconcile your Spanish self with the French language? And that same disconnect is present for thousands of people who have that disconnect within them. He's adamant about writing in a language other than Franco's language, but he feels loyalty towards his Spanish self. It's his native language. It's continuous with his own self. He cannot dissociate himself from the images evoked by specific words. Those words lose power when they're translated. So although he deliberately writes in French, his bond to the Spanish language reveals the extent to which it has shaped him. His first language, Spanish, makes a claim on his self. His decision to write in French can only succeed if he internalizes the second language concepts. It's that notion, again, of fragmentation, the idea of going beyond, of reconstituting the fragmentation in a manner that escapes limitations of all colonial powers. His distrust of a fixed discourse extends to the French language for a terrible reason. The notions of freedom, equality, and fraternity, liberté, égalité, fraternité, precepts that I would grow up with in school, had been betrayed by the same government expected to uphold those democratic ideals. Thousands of vanquished Spaniards, enemies of Franco, fled to France. 500,000 men, women, and children crossed the Pyrenees in 1939, in February, including my father's family, to take refuge in France. This country was undeniably going to welcome them. They had cried tears of sorrow after leaving everything that was there behind. Now they were crying tears of joy and relief when they crossed into France, because this was the land of égalité, fraternité, et liberté, right? But they had been betrayed by the country they came into. The France of non-intervention politics was guilty of facilitating the spread of European fascism. By not coming to Spain's democratically elected Third Republic during the 3-year war waged against Franco's armies, supported by Hitler and Mussolini, as we know, France unwittingly cleared the way for Nazis. As they crossed into France, the men were separated from the wives and children and placed on the beach in camps. Tens of thousands of Spanish war veterans would watch behind barbed wire confines of France's brutal internment camps, its own fault, to the enemy, without doubting for a moment it was an inevitable consequence of political inaction and collective passivity. Many would choose to drown themselves in the Mediterranean rather than stay prisoners. Betrayal, absurdity would mark the experience of these people, where, for example, one camp internee would be assigned the task of decorating the barbed wires with the inscription Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. So that motto, which was born from the fire that caused the monarchy to fall, which I grew up hearing as markers of France's superiority in human rights, meant its opposite to my father's family, and of course to myself. Freedom, equality, and fraternity, yes, but not for all. Fragile and powerful, these words France believes to be carved in stone are only as strong as the people who stand behind them. Left on their own, they become feral. They embody people's worst traits. After all, if we're not careful, words can make fools of us all, as we keep seeing. And they should be considered as capable of causing great harm. If we're not careful, these words, this language we inhabit, will play with us like they're the master puppeteer in our life and claw at us like wildcats. To stand up to them, we have to accept our own fragility and the prison house of language that we come with. The perspective we need to step back and understand how easily we fall into traps by our native language can be avoided, or at least identified, when we step into another language, discover new words, new cultures, manners to communicate. By doing so, we understand the vulnerability our students experience when they embark not just in a foreign language, but in a field unknown to them. What does it mean for us in terms of being your educators, it helps us understand that distance, that foreignness. For students, it creates a bridge to understand the world. Why the differences are there, what they actually mean. Because they never mean what we think until we move into another language. As for me, it's no secret, I am to this day deeply enamored of the languages that I teach. I rejoice at navigating between them, but for me the language of the heart is, en español, and that arrogant, self-sufficient, superior, condescending, yet beautiful language that is la langue française. Intersectionalities in the Francophone world was the topic of my presentation today. However, we all come with a language that limits us. We saw today the instability of language as demonstrated in Saint-Prince Algarabi, and more so the vulnerability lived by those who experience linguistic discrimination. How to fight this discrimination? Easy. Step out of your own prison house of language, experience the vulnerability, understand through the study of another language what another culture feels like, try it on, see how it fits. That same linguistic vulnerability is essential to our understanding of the otherness. Here's my last question for you. Does anybody know, are there any philosophers here? Does anybody know the parable of the look in Jean-Paul Sartre? Of being in nothingness, l'être néant? You know Sartre? Famous existentialist, cranky French dude. Hell is other people. L'enfer, c'est les autres. No? Gosh, that guy had issues too. But he was brilliant. So it's pretty simple. There's a guy in the hallway. He's looking at a keyhole into someone's room. And he's watching whatever's going on in there. We don't know what it is. Until the guy in the hallway realizes that someone else, in turn, is also watching him. You never heard this? It's fantastic. So, the subject becomes an object. The guy who thought of himself as just this omniscient consciousness, observing people doing whatever they were doing, understands that he too has a physical presence that can be observed. He sees himself because he is seen. 101. But the same, what's interesting to me, is that the same can be said of language. When you learn another language, you realize that your own can be seen, an object, like any other. At the beginning of our talk today, I said regarding intersectionality in the context of the Charlie Hebdo murders, that we needed to always be asking questions about the role of race and gender, economics, religion in the state. It means we were always looking beyond our borders and our boundaries. Well, it's my conviction that the path to looking beyond lies in learning other languages. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming today. Do you have questions? Questions? And we'll run out of time.
A comment that
Yes.
just occurred to me, Agarabi and Agarabia. There's another nuance there.
Yes.
Because the word Agarabia has a
Arab, al.
root.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
it encompasses, so it's an invented
The four-
word in French. But it's also a word in Spanish that denotes the Arab presence.
That's right.
And root.
That's right.
So it's just a good intersection.
Right, it's a struggle of force through the language, right? The powers that be trying to hierarchize, put in hierarchy, right? Yeah, that's absolutely true. Thank you. Yes.
How has your mother reconciled living in France and having the treatment? Has she risen above all that? Said, I realize where they're coming from and been able to...
You know, so she's been in the States for several years, but she spent decades. And she likes to say that all the vices that she picked up in France. She reconciled to some extent, but she was also deeply hurt because that notion of betrayal, which I didn't really have time to talk about, when you have the expectation, just like the refugees or immigrants going somewhere else thinking it's going to be great, or at least better, and it's not, or like for her, she was Second World War generation. So for her, America, you know, were the good guys, and they had helped Europe, and they had helped France, so she couldn't understand that in France you had resentment for the role of Americans, and then the anti-Vietnam War sentiment was sort of a channeling of that, but then it had been there before. I think that at the root it was really about resenting, you know, the Marshall Plan, I mean, just all the rebuilding of Europe that had happened. Right? So she reconciled to some extent. She had to get into a lot of fights for her. I had to get into a lot of fights. She would get into fights and then I had to step in. Bonjour.
So I had an example of some irony. I was in doing some law climbing outside of Paris. I can't remember it.
Fontainebleau?
Fontainebleau, yeah. And this French gentleman, you know, I was talking with my friend who was from France. He was speaking to me in English. And another gentleman overheard me. He said, "Oh, from the Pyrenees, United States."
What?
And once I realized what this guy had said, I'm like, "Oh my God, you're calling me Jersey? You're from the United States?" But that was really quite ironic, considering what you just been talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. It's true. We should probably let everybody go to class. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.